Alright, welcome to another video presentation of a slideshow that I've done. Today's topic is on what is called the Deuterocanon, also known as the Apocrypha. So we're just going to jump right into it. So, let's see. So we're going to go through some history of the Old Testament up until we get to the history of what is recorded in the Apocrypha. So in Old Testament history, we're going to start with what is called the Great Assembly and some synopsis of the Old Testament, right? So we have the history recorded in the Protestant Old Testament begins with Adam and continues through each age, ending with the book of Malachi. I call this the Protestant Old Testament because it is the one that most people would be aware of in the order as Christians. It is a different order of books in the Jewish Bible. So, in Jewish history, sometime between 516 BC and 332 BC, which was a time known at, which would be during the early Second Temple period. What that is referring to, so in the storyline of the Bible, in 600 BC, or around that time, 597, around that time, Nebuchadnezzar, who was king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and destroyed the whole city and destroyed the temple and took everybody basically hostage. 70 years later or so, the Jews started to return to Jerusalem and they end up building the temple. So this time frame, 516 BC is when it started, starts a time where there was a gathering of 120 prophets, scribes, or sages known as the Great Assembly. This is not one happening, like one time people come together. This is more of a governing body, and it happened for around 200 years. So the Great Assembly was when all the prophets, there was sages, scribes, and the scribes came from the Levites, but there was I guess you could say, a governing body at the time, and they formed after the Babylonian exile. This body helped compile and seal the Hebrew scriptures up to their time. They standardized Jewish prayer, and they coordinated the Jewish calendar. It was likely during this era that synagogues began to emerge more prominently, especially as local centers for worship and study outside of the temple, as they had likely started while the Jews were in exile away from the temple that had been destroyed. There's not a ton of info on the history of synagogues, but at this time, around 516, when they came back from Babylon, they likely were a part of the Persian Empire, or that was prominent at the time. And what eventually happens around 332. I think Malachi is the last prophet, and I believe he died in 313. And the reason this changed, I know we're talking about the start or end of the Great Assembly, but why it changed was Alexander the Great went through all of that region and conquered everything, and so the world changed at the end of the Great Assembly. And that is why Greek becomes the lingua franca, the language that everybody uses at that time. Now, the reason I mention that is because synagogue, the word, is a Greek word, but it is likely that during the Babylonian exile in 600 BC, that because they were away from the temple, the tradition of meeting in a synagogue or a house of worship, to where they would read the scriptures and those traditions. That is likely when it started, but during the Great Assembly is likely when it was more solidified, and eventually it got the name synagogue from the Greek language. Interesting history there. So around 150 BC, after the Great Assembly, now I guess maybe I'll drive this point home a little bit more. In the Great Assembly is when they compiled all the scriptures, and they basically, in my opinion, it seems that they solidified Jewish religious practice at that time, probably with the intent to never go into exile again. But But after that, around 150 BC, the Pharisee tradition began to take shape. So this is after. Emphasizing oral law and interpretation. After the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, so later on, these teachings of the Pharisees evolved into what we now call rabbinical Judaism, which became the dominant form of Jewish religious life that we know of today. So the Great Assembly may have also represented a formal rededication to the covenant, a collective resolve to worship the one true God and avoid future exile. Though some details are debated, it is likely that during this period, Jews transitioned from the Paleo-Hebrew script to the Aramaic square script for writing Hebrew, reflecting the broader cultural shifts. This is likely why the Dead Sea Scrolls contains both versions of multiple ancient books from before 200 BC. That is a reference to what is called Paleo-Hebrew and the current form of Aramaic Hebrew, which uses different characters, but it's the same language per se. Right? There's ancient Hebrew, and then there's ancient Hebrew, and then there's the Hebrew of today. But a lot of change happened at this time. They compiled what was all of the stuff to their time. So traditional members of the Great Assembly included Ezra, Nehemiah, Mordecai, who is one of the prominent characters in Esther, Zerubbabel, Daniel, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and then Simon the Just, who was a prominent high priest at the time. So, moving forward a little bit, we're going to review this and then probably go back and forth in time, but on the Jewish canon of scripture written in 91 AD, so in a work titled Against Apion, which was written by Josephus against an Egyptian named Apion, on the topic of histories written by their ancestors. So he's writing a polemic against Apion, and he has this to say. So he says, "For we have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from and contradicting one another, as the Greeks have, but only 22 books, which contain the record of all the times past, which are justly believed to be divine. And of them 5 belong to Moses, which contains his laws and the traditions of the origin of mankind till his death. This interval of time was little short of 3,000 years. But as to the time of the death of Moses, till the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, who reigned after Xerxes, the prophets who were after Moses wrote down what was done in their time in 13 books. The remaining 4 books contain hymns to God and precepts for the conduct of human life." So he doesn't exactly name them, but he says there's 22 books that the Jews in 91 AD, that we accept, and there's a brief description of them. He basically says there's the law, the history, and then hymns to some degree. He says that. Then he says, "It is true our history hath been written since Artaxerxes, very particularly, but hath not been esteemed of like authority with the former by our forefathers, because there hath not been an exact succession of prophets since that time. And how firmly we have given credit to those books of our own nation is evident by what we do. For during so many ages as have already passed, no one has been so bold as either to add anything to them or take anything from them, or to make any change in them. But it becomes natural to all Jews, immediately and upon their very birth, to esteem those books to certain divine doctrines, and to persist in them, and if occasion be, willing to die for them." That's from Josephus against Apion, chapter 1, paragraph 8. So what he is saying here is that there are 22 books that they say at his time are scripture. And then he says there are other books, but we don't exactly put them on the same level of scripture because there's no prophets. That's at least what a Jew says in 91 AD. He was a Jewish historian, and he wrote this against an Egyptian Greek speaking person. So on this, I found this on archive.com in Josephus against Apion. Basically, it's right here. I read up to right there where it says willing to die. He then makes an example after this, just for context, what we're talking about, I guess. He basically says that just like the Greeks do, they have history. But then he says some of the histories that he's not making fun of, but what he's against is that he knows that some of the people writing histories in their time are writing them and they have no knowledge of it because they're not there. Anyway, that's his argument, but some of the details, this is where we get some knowledge of what existed for the Jews at that time. Now, what is the Deuterocanon or Apocrypha in light of what we talked about? So the Deuterocanon is therefore books written after the Great Assembly. So we started Great Assembly 516 BC to 332 BC, and then I skipped to 91 to show that the Jews did not accept them. But what is the Deuterocanon? It was written after the Great Assembly, during a time when the Jews did not have a prophet to speak to them. They had organized worship and society in a way that was trying to hedge against returning to idol worship, so they were very careful, not wanting to be exiled and brought to God's judgment again. So during what is called the time of silence between Malachi and the New Testament, where no prophet rose up to say, "Thus says the Lord," there were books written. Some of these books are histories, some are epics, some a continuation of the wisdom tradition, which would be books like Proverbs or Ecclesiastes. Also books written under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, or that's at least the idea of the wisdom tradition. And then there's additions to other well-known books also. So, that was just a synopsis. We're going to go now to the time of Jesus. So the Sadducees, at the time of Jesus, I know we're in the middle of that timeline again, the Sadducees rejection of the writings and the prophets. So I'm using this as an example to say that the Jewish canon of Scripture was not absolutely defined and solidified at the time that Jesus Christ walked this earth, and it can be seen by the witness of the Gospels. So in Matthew 22:23, the same day the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him with a question. Mark 12:18, then the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to Jesus and questioned him. Luke 20:27, some of the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to Jesus with a question. Acts 23:8, for the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Now, what does that mean? Why did the Sadducees reject the concept of resurrection? Well, this is because they only believed in the Torah. They were Torah only. Torah means the law. In other words, the 5 books of Moses. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They rejected all the books after these. So, is the canon decided at their time? I don't think so. One reason I would say this is because the Sadducees and the Pharisees were seen together a lot of the time, and they would question Jesus, all that type of stuff in the storyline of the New Testament. But they were not cast out of society and shunned for being Torah only, which shows that it was not absolutely solidified. They were still trying, I guess you could say, to gain, the different factions were trying to gain prominence through argumentation, which is what the Pharisees and Sadducees do a lot to Jesus. They argue, right? Anyway, so the Sadducees' rejection of everything but the Torah, because they rejected everything but the Torah, they did not accept all of these references. Here's some examples in Ezekiel 37, 1-14. This is the part of the Bible where it says the vision of dry bones. Coming to life represents Israel's restoration, but also evokes an imagery of resurrection. Psalm 16:10 says, "For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption." Psalm 49:15, "But God will ransom my soul from the power of Sheol, for he will receive me." Isaiah 53:10-11, which is the suffering servant chapter, says, "He shall see his offspring, and he shall prolong his days." Daniel 12:2, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." Isaiah 26:19, "Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise, and you who dwell in the dust awake and sing for joy." Job 19:25-27, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God." Hosea 6:2. After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up, that we may live before him. 1 Kings 17:17 through 24 talks about Elijah raising a widow's son. 2 Kings 4:32 through 37, Elijah raises the Shunammite woman's son. That's Elisha. I think I said Elijah. And then 2 Kings 13:21, a man is revived when his body touches Elisha's bones. Right? They rejected those, which is why they didn't believe in the resurrection. All I'm doing is showing that the Jews at the time of Jesus did not have a solidified canon, I guess you would call it, that everyone accepted. It was still being decided upon, and now, just for context, the word canon means rule. In other words, it means like, what is the rule or ruler, I guess you could say, the ruler that we will judge ourselves against to know whether we are right or not, something like that, right? Canon means what is the rule we will put ourselves up against that is accepted across. It comes from Latin. Now, they did not have an agreed upon canon list of scripture. Furthermore, the Pharisees accepted all of the Hebrew books, which is, we'll get to it in a second when we talk about the Essenes. So the Sadducees accepted Torah only. Then we have the Essenes, of which, a really quick note, John the Baptist seemed to have been an Essene. I don't know if that's confirmed, but it's possible. So the Essenes seemed to have accepted all scripture or sacred writings, right? So they collected all that they could find and hid them into caves. Then most of them died in the war against Rome in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed by Titus, who was the Roman emperor. This seems to be what happened, and this is at Qumran, Israel, which is, northeast? It's east of Jerusalem, towards the Dead Sea, really close to the Dead Sea. They found as much as they could and hid them in caves. And then they went to war, and the war was lost. The Jews were, I guess, were not victorious. The temple was destroyed a second time. And then most of the Essenes died. At least that has to be thought to be what happened, because those caves were lost. So everybody who knew about them, it seems, died, because in 1948, the scriptures found in them are known. In 1948, they found the caves. What they found in them was all of the writings, and those are known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. I know that was a big tangent. But there was another faction at the time known as the Zealots, and they focused on the Torah, but they accepted much of everything else. Now the Zealots, real fast, side note, they disagreed with a man named Judas Maccabeus, who, when he was at war with a Persian, I guess, country, he gave up, I guess you could say, and he went to the Congress, or Parliament, whatever you call it, the Assembly, at Rome, and asked for them to intervene. And that is why in the New Testament, the Jews are subject to Rome, because Judas did that. The Zealots wanted to take that back. They didn't believe that Judas should have asked Rome to help, because then they became subject to Rome. So, a lot of political stuff in this. But then we have the Herodians. They didn't care much for scripture, but cared mostly for the political power that they had and the rule that they had, because they're named after King Herod. They didn't really care about anything, but they were a kind of ruling family. The kings of, not really kings. They were the ruling class that the Romans allowed to be in charge. Now, we're going to go back a little bit again to 285 BC. Between that and 245 BC, there is a pharaoh. Pharaoh of Egypt. His name is Ptolemy II Philadelphus. So he asks the high priest in Jerusalem to provide 6 translators from each of the 12 tribes of Israel to translate the Jewish scriptures into Greek. We'll get into a little bit more history in a second, but legend is told that it took the 72 translators 72 days to translate the Torah into Greek at that time, which would be the 5 books of Moses. So Ptolemy then places the translation into the Library of Alexandria. The translation is today known as the Septuagint, which is the Latin word for 70. So it was always spoken of as the translation of the 70. So Why? Why talk about the Septuagint at this point? Well, because it included the Deuterocanon or Apocrypha. We're just going through some history of the Old Testament, the Bible, that type of stuff. So, here is an extract from Josephus again. We're back to Josephus in Antiquity of the Jews, Book 12, Chapter 2, Paragraph 1. It tells this story. So, Chapter 2 says how Ptolemy Philadelphus procured the laws of the Jews to be translated into the Greek tongue and set many captives free and dedicated many gifts to God. So, that was a synopsis of the chapter. It says, when Alexander, that's Alexander the Great, had reigned 12 years, and after him Ptolemy Soter 40 years, Philadelphus then took the kingdom of Egypt, and held it 40 years within one. That must mean unified. He procured the law to be interpreted, and set free those that were come from Jerusalem into Egypt, and were in slavery there, who were 120,000. The occasion was this: Demetrius Phalereus, who was library keeper to the king, was now endeavoring, if it were possible, to gather together all the books that were in the habitable earth, and buying whatsoever was anywhere valuable or agreeable to the king's inclination, who was very earnestly set upon collecting of books, to which inclination of his Demetrius was zealously subservient. This just means that he's buying all the books that the pharaoh wants, and he has to do it, whether he likes it or not, I guess. And when once Ptolemy asked him how many 10,000s of books he had collected, he replied that he had already about 20 times 10,000, but that in a little time he should have 50 times 10,000. But he said he had been informed that there were many books of laws among the Jews worthy of inquiring after, and worthy of the king's library, but that which, being written in characters and in a dialect of their own, will cause no small pains in getting them translated into the Greek tongue. That the character in which they were written seems to be like that to which is the proper character of the Syrians, and that its sound, when pronounced, is like theirs also. So he's like, it's Hebrew, and it sounds like the Syrians, which we don't understand. And that this sound appears to be peculiar to themselves. Wherefore he said that nothing hindered why they might not get those books to be translated also, for while nothing is wanting that is necessary for that purpose, we may have their books also in this library. The king thought that Demetrius was very zealous to procure him abundance of books, and that he suggested what was exceedingly proper for him to do, and therefore he wrote to the Jewish high priest that they should act accordingly. So, the legendary Alexandrian library, the pharaoh who made it as big as it was, asked for the high priest to translate the books for him and send some priests to do so. Later on in history, that library burned down, and many of the texts of the ancient world were lost because of it. Interestingly enough, the Septuagint was not lost. There's also some other ones. But he collected a ton of books, and then when it burned down, it ended up losing a ton of books to history. Now, starting here in Josephus against Appian, Book 2, Paragraph 5, he tells the story a little bit differently like this. It says, Alexander honored our nation to such a degree that for the equity and the fidelity which the Jews exhibited to him, he permitted them to hold the country of Samaria free from tribute. On the same mind was Ptolemy the son of Lagus as to those Jews who dwelt at Alexandria. For he entrusted the fortresses of Egypt into their hands, as believing they would keep them faithfully and valiantly for them. And when he was desirous to secure the government of Cyrene and the other cities of Libya to himself, he sent a party of Jews to inhabit them. And as for his successor, Ptolemy, who was called Philadelphus, he did not only set all those of our nation free who were captive under him, but he did give a great deal of money for their ransom. And that was and what was his greatest work of all, he had a great desire of knowing our laws and of obtaining the books of our sacred scriptures. Accordingly, he desired that such men might be sent to him, as might interpret our law to him, and in order to have them well compiled. He committed the care to no ordinary persons, but ordained that Demetrius, Phalereus, and Andreas, and Aristeus would do so. Right. That one kind of ends in the middle. Now, in Antiquity of the Jews, Book 12, Chapter 2, Paragraph 15, he ends here's a little bit more detail. And it says, when the king had received these books from Demetrius, as we have said already, he adored them and gave order that great care should be taken of them, that they might remain uncorrupted. He also desired that the interpreters would come often to him out of Judea, and that both on account of the respect that he would pay them, and on account of the presents he would make them. For he said it was now but just to send them away, although if of their own accord there could come to him hereafter, they should obtain all that their own wisdom might justly require, and what his generosity was about to give them, so that he sent them away, and gave to every one of them 3 garments of the best sort, and 2 talents of gold, and a cup of the value of 1. I cut that one off, didn't I? So basically, he cherished the Greek Septuagint translation of the law. Now, completion of the translation of the Septuagint, this one's kind of a disputed point, and that is because we know that the Torah, based on the legend, which to some degree is lavishly expounded, we know, right, it said that 72 translators translated in 72 days, or blah, blah, blah. We don't know if that's absolute historic, per se, but we know that the Torah was a part of the first translation. Now, why is this a disputed point, the completion of the translation of the Septuagint? Because some people don't know, or they don't admit when the rest of the Bible, Old Testament Bible, was translated to Greek. So, the completion of the Septuagint translation from Hebrew to Greek was finished sometime before 132, as the prologue of the book of Sirach states. At least this is my claim, right? So we're going to read this. So Sirach 1, verse 1, which is actually a prologue, written by the grandson of the author of Sirach. So, there's a guy, he writes Sirach, and then his grandson finds it. We're going to read it right now. It says, whereas many and great things have been delivered unto us by the law and the prophets, and by others that have followed their steps, for the which thing Israel ought to be commended for learning and wisdom, and wherefore not only the reader must needs become skillful themselves, but also they that desire to learn be able to profit them which are without, both by speaking and by writing. My grandfather, Jesus, when he had given himself to the reading of the law and the prophets and other books of our fathers, and had gotten therein good judgment, was drawn on also himself to write something pertaining to learning and wisdom, to the intent that those which are desirous to learn and are addicted to these things might profit much more in living according to the law. Wherefore let me entreat you to read it with favor and attention, and to pardon us wherein we may seem to come short of some words which we have labored to interpret. For the same thing uttered in Hebrew and translated into another tongue have not the same force in them, and not only these things, but the law itself and the prophets and the rest of the books have no small difference, when they are spoken in their own language. For in the 8th and 30th year coming into Egypt, when Euergetes was king, and continuing there some time, I found a book of no small learning. Therefore I thought it was most necessary for me to bestow some diligence and travail to interpret it, using great watchfulness and skill in that space, to bring the book to an end, and set it forth with them also, which in a strange country are willing to learn, being prepared before in manners to live after the law. What he's saying is that in there, my grandfather wanted to learn a lot of things. He read the scriptures, blah, 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 and then he wrote one himself. And then I want to translate it to Greek because he wrote it in Hebrew. Then he says that there is a translation loss from Hebrew. Now, this guy's a Jew, so he prefers Hebrew, but he's going to translate it into Greek. And he says that the law and the prophets and the rest of the books have no small difference when they're spoken in their own language. I think that this is a reference to the fact that the entire Septuagint was completed by his time. Moving on. So, we're going to move forward just a little bit in time as well to the time of the Latin Vulgate. We're just going over the history of the Apocrypha real fast, right? So in around 382 AD, Jerome translated the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament into Latin at the request of Pope Damasus I. His translation was not the first Latin translation, but the Pope wanted a unified translation. So what Jerome did was he was taught Hebrew by Jewish teachers, who, of which Jerome names one of them, who was Bar Anina. He does that in his apology against Rufinus in this place, and then in what is called letter number 84, which is to Pamachius and Oceanus. Right? He names one of his teachers, but he was likely taught in secret or seclusion because of the tensions between Jews and Christians in his time. Right? He decided to learn Hebrew so that he could translate the Old Testament to Latin based on the Pope asking him to. So, right? Now, early on in his translation, which took 23 years, and it started in 382 AD and finished in 404 to 405 AD as well. Now, this is the timeline of what you would call the Jewish Old Testament, right? After this time, in 405. After that, he continued to translate, and he did translate the Apocrypha. But I'm focusing on just this point right here. So it took him 23 years to translate the Hebrew Old Testament up until 405 AD. He seems to have adopted the opinion of the Jewish teachers at the time. And evidence of this is the commentary at the beginning of 1st to 2nd Samuel and 1st to 2nd Kings. That is one book in his, that's what we would call it, is 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. But it's known as the helmeted introduction. And he says this prologue to the scriptures may be appropriate as a helmeted introduction to all the books which we turn from Hebrew into Latin, so that we may be able to know whatever is outside of these is set aside among the Apocrypha. And he means the Jews do that. But it seems he agrees. Therefore, wisdom, which is commonly ascribed to Solomon, the book of Jesus son of Sirach, and Judith and Tobias and the shepherd are not in the canon. I have found the first book of the Maccabees is Hebrew, and the second is Greek, which may also be proven by their styles. He doesn't say anything else after that, what he thinks about them. That's from Jerome in the Latin Vulgate, the beginning of the prologue of Saint Jerome to the Book of Kings in paragraph number 6. So it seems like he agrees, or he found that the Jews do not accept what he would call the Apocrypha, the hidden books, the ones that are not revealed, I guess you could say. Apocalypse revealed, Apocrypha hidden. Moving on. So, at least 9 years later, in about 391 AD, Jerome finds in his studying that the Jews reject the Apocrypha, and he claims to some degree that what Josephus claims, that it is because there are 22 books of the Old Testament based on the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, though he doesn't say it's because of no prophet at the time. Josephus says that in one of his, that it's only right that there's 22 books and that one book for each of the Hebrew letters. This slide, we're going to show a little bit of, there's not a discrepancy, just like it still doesn't show solidification. It seems like an idea or a tradition that the Jews had at the time. So he says he names the books of the Old Testament and shows how at his time they are divided, of which here's an example. So Josephus in 91 AD, now this is a possible way to fit the numbers that Josephus said. We read his book, the section of the book where he says this earlier. Now I've just compiled a list of what is possible, but he doesn't exactly explicitly say this, but this is what it would look like, right? So you have the 5, he said there was 5 books, and then 13 books, and then 4 books. And I've compared that to Jerome's in 400 AD. He says that this is from the Jews, and this is what they accept. All the ones that are read are the same. So we have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And that seems to be the 5 books, right? And then Josephus, in his time, said that there was 13. Joshua, Judges, which must have included Ruth, because later on they do the same thing, include Ruth, right? Samuel 1 and 2 combined as one book. Kings as one book. Isaiah, right here, Isaiah, Jeremiah, including Lamentations, as one book. And then Ezekiel, the 12 minor prophets, which was one book considered, which is kind of the same today. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Those are all the same. And that would be Jerome's 8 books. This is him saying, this is what the Jews at my time accept. Now, in Josephus's, it is likely that he had Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah considered as one book, and then Chronicles as one book. And then if you compare that, right, then you would have 4 others: Psalm, Proverbs, Job, and the Song of Songs. In Jerome's, those ones that are in the 13 up here had to have been down here. Now, Josephus's is kind of an assumption, because he doesn't say there's 5 and here's what they are, and then there's 13 and here's exactly what they are. So there's a little conjecture here, but the numbers are different, at least changed. Now, here's a note. There's one of the bishops before Jerome's time was named Melito of Sardis, and around 160 to 170 AD, he also names 22 books, just like Josephus did, but he does not list them out in a number, so he doesn't say there's 5 for the prophets, and then blah 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 number for the writings, and then blah 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 number for the law of the prophets and the writings. He doesn't name them number-wise, he just says there's 22 books, right? But he does name the books, right? So he puts a list together, he just doesn't say the number of each category of the Jews at his time, but he leaves out Esther, and he includes Wisdom of Solomon. Interesting. Now, moving on, during the translation of the Vulgate, in defense of his learning Hebrew and translating to Latin, Jerome preferred the Hebrew originals, but he expressed that he was willing to defer to the Church, as he admitted that the Church was given the promise of being led into all truth. So, in a letter named Against Rufinus in 402 AD, he defended the Deuterocanonical portions of Daniel, which is from the Greek Septuagint additions to Daniel, saying, "What sin have I committed if I follow the judgment of the churches?" So he's saying he accepts the Deuterocanonical portions of Daniel, the additions of Daniel from the Greek, and he says, "What sin have I committed for if I follow those ones?" That's in Jerome, Apology Against Rufinus, Book 2, Chapter 33. He also quotes Sirach 13, verse 2, as scripture in a letter to Eustochium, in letter number 108, showing his eventual acceptance of the Deuterocanon. And this one is in 404 AD, right? In 382, 391, he kind of uses the Jewish idea that, oh, these books are not canon, right? They're not accepted, right? But by 402, 404, he seems to have accepted. He says, "I relate this story not because I approve of persons rashly taking upon themselves burdens beyond their strength, for does not the Scripture say, 'Burden not thyself above thy power'?" That's Sirach 13:2. "But because I wish from this quality of perseverance in her to shew the passions of her mind and the yearning of her believing soul, both of which made her sing in David's words, 'My soul thirsteth for thee, my flesh longeth after thee.'" So that's St. Jerome, Epistle to Eustochium, number 108, chapter 21, written in 404 AD. I think this is the last one on Jerome. So later on in his translation of the Apocryphal books in 407, little side note on this, he finished and presented the Vulgate around 404 to 405, and he continued translating. And then he did the Apocryphal books. So in his commentary introduction of the book of Judith, which is part of the Apocrypha, he says, "Among the Jews, the book of Judith is considered among the Apocrypha. Its warrant for affirming those apocryphal texts, which has come into dispute, is deemed less than sufficient. Moreover, since it was written in the Chaldean language, it is counted among the historical books. But since the Nicene Council is considered to have counted this book among the number of sacred scriptures, I have acquiesced to your request," or should I say demand. He's talking to a friend. "And my other work set aside, from which I was forcibly restrained. I have given a single night's work, translating according to sense rather than verbatim. I have hacked away at the excessively error-ridden panoply of the many codices. I conveyed in Latin only what I could find expressed coherently in the Chaldean words. Receive the widow Judith, example of chastity, and with triumphant praise acclaim her with eternal public celebration. For not only for women, but even for men, she has been given as a model by the one who rewards her chastity, who has ascribed to her such virtue that she conquered the unconquered among humanity and surmounted the insurmountable. That is Jerome in the Latin Vulgate, Introduction to Judith. Now, that was a history of the Deuterocanon, also known as the Apocrypha. Whether you accept it or not, we're just going through history. Now, I'm going to tell you what the books are, and then my synopsis of it, since I read it, and these are my words on what each book is about. So the Deuterocanonical books include Tobit, Judith, additions to Esther, Wisdom of Solomon, Wisdom of Sirach, also known as Ecclesiasticus or just Sirach. Then there's Baruch and the Epistle of Jeremiah, and then the Prayer of Azariah, Susanna, Song of the Three Holy Children, and then Bel and the Dragon. Those are all additions to Daniel. And then there's 1st and 2nd Maccabees. So, the Book of Tobit, I wouldn't say written, it is about the time of around 700 BC, which would be 20 or so years after Isaiah, when the northern tribe is exiled, I guess taken captive by Assyria. So Tobit is a story about a man named Tobit and his son Tobias. Tobit is a man living in Nineveh during the Assyrian exile of the northern tribes around 700 BC, also the time of Isaiah. Tobit dedicates his time to respecting the dead who are strewn throughout the city because of their slavery and mistreatment, even in the face of the king of Assyria declaring that it is against the law to bury the dead, in an attempt to demoralize the captive Israelites. So basically they torture them, they're slaves, they kill them, and Tobit dedicates his time to respecting the dead and burying them. But the king says it's against the law to bury the dead, right? And there's also other laws as we go on. Jewish laws, right? He finds and buries dead bodies and completes the days of purification regularly, right? There's a part of the law of Moses was that if you touch a dead body, you are impure. I think it's for 7 days, right? So he would regularly go out and respect the dead, and then he would, right? So it's supposed to be that he is a righteous man. So during the story, he is tested with losing his sight because by bird droppings landing in his eyes. In response, he cannot care for his family, so he sends his son Tobias to procure a debt owed to him from a man in another town. Around this time, a man named Azariah from their same tribe of Israel appears and agrees to help Tobias on his journey. Along the way, they find a large fish in the Tigris River, which they catch, and Azariah tells Tobias to keep the fish. In a separate story arc, Sarah lives in the town Tobias is going to. Her father owes the debt to Tobit. She is possessed of a demon who slays her husband on their wedding night every time she's married. And this has happened 7 times. This is likely why the Sadducees make up the story of what if there's a woman and she's married and she goes through 7 wives and who will she be married to in the resurrection is probably based on them making fun of the Book of Tobit. So then, when Tobias arrives, Azariah has him boil the heart and liver of the large fish that they had caught to cast the demon away. Then Tobias then marries Sarah and gets the debt owed to his father from her father. They travel back to Nineveh, where Azariah has Tobit use the fish's gall to anoint the eyes of his father, which heals the blindness. At this time, Azariah reveals himself, his true self, as Raphael the angel, one of the 7 angels who present prayers to God, which is probably at least it's referenced in Revelation 8:2-4, that there's 7 holy angels that present the prayers to God. He instructs them to write down their story for future generations. That is the story of the Book of Tobit. Just a journey to go get a debt owed to somebody because father's blind. And then you get the debt, and then also your father's not blind anymore. The Book of Judith, which is an epic, right? So Judith is a widow who during a siege of their city by King Nebuchadnezzar, she acts heroically. The general of the army attacking at the time is named Holofernes. Judith gains the trust of the guards, so she acts like she defects. She gains the trust of the guard, and eventually the captain of the army due to her beauty, and she feigns that she's willing to defect and help Holofernes defeat the Hebrews in the city. She establishes an alibi by going outside of the camp a few nights in a row to pray, refusing to eat their food or drink their wine. After a few days, when they hold a banquet, she ensures they all get intoxicated. So she basically feigns that she needs to go away and pray. She creates this like alibi. I'm just going out to pray. Gets them all intoxicated. So then once they are back in the captain's tent, he passes out. She chops off his head and places it in a bag. She sneaks back out of the camp and takes the head to the Hebrews and uses it to boost their morale to fight for their freedom from the siege. The story highlights aspects of faith, the power of fasting and prayer, hope in the face of adversity, and obedience and surrender to God. Next book is which would be the longer version or the additions to the book of Esther. There's some history here, so we're going to talk about it and then talk about the history. So this excerpt adds details to the story of Esther. In the beginning of the story, King Xerxes asks for his wife to join him in a banquet. She refuses, so Xerxes decides to replace the queen. So he scours the land. Esther is chosen as one of the beautiful virgins, I guess you would call it. She was an orphan who was raised by Mordecai. We talked about him earlier in the Great Assembly. He was part of the Great Assembly, right? Which was her cousin. Mordecai has a dream that 2 eunuchs plan to kill King Xerxes. He tells Esther, and she tells the king. At the same time, there's a guy named Haman, who is an Amalekite. And let's see, Haman is raised to a high position of the kingdom. He tries to require everyone to bow down to him, like him himself, right? And Mordecai refuses. Haman then issues a decree for all the Jews in the land as a plot to exterminate the Jews, especially Mordecai. So he just decides to kill all of them, especially Mordecai, because of this. So then Queen Esther, who was chosen during this time to be the queen because she was the most beautiful and all that, who had been admitted to the king's court without his knowledge that she was Jewish, she gains the favor of the king first, then reveals her heritage. She reveals the treachery of Haman, who wished to exterminate her people. Haman then is executed instead, and Mordecai is given a high position in the kingdom. So, important key aspects about the Greek version in the Apocrypha of Esther. So, here's a little bit of a history, not really lesson, but in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they did not find any of the books of Esther, and it is usually described or said as the reason why is because it does not reference God or Jehovah, Yahweh, in the Hebrew. So in the Greek version, God is named. So in the Hebrew version of Esther, God is never mentioned, but in the Greek version, God's name appears over 50 times, making divine providence and intervention central to the story. Esther is portrayed as a deeply devout heroine. The edition portrays Esther as a deeply pious woman. She prays, fasts, and expresses anguish over her marriage to a non-Jewish king, none of which appears in the Hebrew text. These editions include 6 extra sections, which are usually labeled A through F, which introduce dreams, prayers, and divine judgments. They transform the story from a political drama, which is the Hebrew version that most people know of, into a tale of faith, identity, and divine justice. So the next book category we're going to talk of is called the Wisdom Books of the Apocrypha. The 2 books of wisdom in the Apocrypha resemble Proverbs and Ecclesiastes of Solomon. They're also very similar to the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes of Jesus, and the Hebrews chapter 11. These all seem to be a connected version of the wisdom tradition. To some degree, I'm introducing other ideas that I have as well, being that Jesus continued that tradition as well in the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes. And then Paul seems to have done it, if Paul's the writer of Hebrews. So written after the manner of Proverbs, both Wisdom of Solomon and Wisdom of Sirach, also known as Ecclesiasticus, contain a quick retelling of Old Testament stories. So this is one aspect of both of them that I'm quickly highlighting before I talk about the whole book. But in Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 10, 1 through 21, the writer recounts how the wisdom of God preserved each prophet, wisdom being synonymous with the Spirit of God. So the name of the Spirit of God in the Apocrypha is usually wisdom. But he recounts the story. So he said, it's kind of, I'll get a little bit ahead, but in Hebrews it says like by faith. I guess that's right here. They're strikingly similar to Hebrews 11, which is the by faith chapter. By faith, Abraham did this. By faith, Noah did this. By faith, Joseph did this. By faith, blah, blah, blah. Wisdom chapter 10 has the same exact structure, and it just says how the wisdom of God preserved each prophet. So it says the wisdom preserved Noah this way. The wisdom preserved blah, blah, blah this way. So, and then in Wisdom of Sirach, which is the one that we read about, where the grandson found it in Hebrew, translated it to Greek, Wisdom of Sirach, chapters 44 through 49, involves what is called a recounting of the hymns of the patriarchs. It's even named. This is a recount of each prophet and how their righteousness preserved an undefiled seed, which is very interesting. So they're very strikingly similar to Hebrews chapter 11, where the writer uses the same format to recount the ancient patriarchs' faithfulness. Those are just interesting tidbits that I found, right? Now we're going to go through some examples of why I think they're very similar. So, Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." In Proverbs, which is this wisdom tradition, it says, "When pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom." In Sirach, "The greater you are, the more humble yourself, so you will find favor in the sight of the Lord." Those seem to be on the same topics, teaching the same thing. Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." In Proverbs, the Old Testament, it says, "Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in your power to act." Blessed are the merciful, right? And then Wisdom of Solomon, "But you, our God, are kind and true, patient and ruling all things in mercy." On the Sermon on the Mount, "But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing." In Proverbs, "One person gives freely, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, but comes to poverty." In Sirach, "Be generous when you worship the Lord, and do not stint the first fruit of your hands." Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." Proverbs, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." And in Wisdom of Solomon, "For wisdom is a kindly spirit, but will not free blasphemers from the guilt of their words, because God is witness of his own inmost self, and a sure observer of his heart, and a listener to his tongue." Jesus, this is not part of the Beatitudes or the Sermon on the Mount, but he teaches, "Come unto me, all ye that are labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Well, in Sirach, it has this, "Come unto me, all ye that be desirous of me," tidbit. This is talking about wisdom. "Come unto me, all ye that are desirous of me, and fill yourself with my fruits, for my memorial is sweeter than honey, and mine inheritance than the honeycomb. They that eat me shall yet be hungry, and they that drink me shall yet be thirsty. He that obeyeth me shall never be confounded, and they that work by me shall not do amiss." Very interesting connection there. Second one, also in Sirach, "Draw near unto me, ye unlearned, and dwell in the house of learning. Wherefore are ye slow, and what say ye these things? Seeing your souls are very thirsty, I opened my mouth and said, Buy her for yourself without money. Put your neck under the yoke, and let your soul receive instruction. She is hard at hand to find. Behold with your eyes how that I have but little labor, and have gotten unto me much rest." These seem to be super, super similar. Now, the reason I am showing this as well is because Sirach was written 285, at least 285, because that's when it was translated. No, wrong timeline. Sirach was written around 185. It was translated in 117 by his grandson. So, some of the things that are in Wisdom of Solomon. So we're going to focus in on Wisdom of Solomon. So wisdom in the book is described as monogenes. That's the Greek word. In Wisdom 7:22. The same word as only begotten, or one and only, that John uses to describe Jesus Christ in the New Testament in John 1:14, 1:18, 3:16, and 3:18. And then wisdom is described as apogasma in Wisdom 6:12, Wisdom 7:25-26, those both places, right? This is the same word as brightness or radiance that is used in Hebrews 1:3, who being the brightness of his glory and express image of his person. Here's an example of it, Wisdom 7:24-26. For she, meaning wisdom, is the brightness of the everlasting light, and the unspotted mirror of the power of God and the image of his goodness. Right, there's the word apokasma in the Greek. There's the Greek version, which is the same as Hebrews 1:3. His Son is the radiance of his glory, the apokasma tis doxis. Glory is doxis. Now, in Wisdom 7:22, for wisdom, which is the worker of all things, taught me, for in her is a understanding spirit holy, one only, or monogenes, which could be monogenous, which is a different form of the same word, which is the word became flesh, lived among us. We saw his glory, such glory as of the one and only Son of the Father, or only begotten Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. Interesting parallels. The same word used in the Apocrypha is used in the New Testament. Maybe that's weak, but I think there's a connection. So, also in the Book of Wisdom of Solomon, so the book contains the first instance of the teaching of putting on the armor of God, which is found in Wisdom 5:17-20, which is the same idea Paul uses in Ephesians 6:13-17, which is likely what influenced his writing of it in his epistle, unless it is a totally separate idea than the other one, both being separately thought of, or they're connected. Wisdom of Solomon chapter 14 condemns idol worship, much like Jeremiah chapter 10 does. It's way longer though, and it says, you cannot trust one who believes in idols, as they have no basis of morality and no one to fear for justice. And he basically makes the connection that idols are fake and they don't even exist. It's literally something you make out of your hands. So if someone was to promise you something and they believe in idols, you can't trust that person because they have no basis of morality and no one to fear if they lie. The book says of the building of idols, for verily, desire of gain devised that, meaning to be able to sell idols. So the building of idols. And the workman built it by his skill. And then it says later of the same topic, for the worshipping of idols cannot be named, of idols not to be named, is the beginning, cause, and end of all evil. Focus on the idea of for verily desire of gain devised the building of idol. Well, what idea is this teaching? Well, Paul echoes this in 2 Timothy 6:10, for the love of money is the root of all evil. This one says the desire of gain devised building of idols, and that is the beginning, cause, and end of all evil. Which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. That was the ending of 2 Timothy 6. Interesting parallels, right? And then we have this next one. He declares that God created all things by his word, and that his word is a sharp two-edged sword, that he ordained man by his wisdom. That's in Wisdom 9:1-2, and then 18:15-16. Which seems to be very interesting, connected to 1 Corinthians 1:24, but unto them which are called, both Jew and Greek, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. Seems to be the same idea. Now, the most interesting chapter in the book of Wisdom of Solomon is Wisdom chapter 2, which seemingly prophesies of what the ungodly would do to the righteous one who claims to be the Son of God, and similarly to Psalm 22, it prophesies what would happen to Jesus Christ. So, here is Wisdom chapter 2, 12-23. It says, therefore, let us lie in wait for the righteous one, because he is not for our turn, and he is clean, contrary to our doings. He upbraideth us with our offending the law, and objecteth to our infamy the transgressions of our education. He professeth to have the knowledge of God, and he calleth himself the child of the Lord. He was made to reprove our thoughts. He is grievous unto us, even to behold. for his life is not like other men's. His ways are of another fashion. We are esteemed of him as counterfeits, and he abstaineth from our ways as from filthiness. He pronounceth the end of the just to be blessed, and maketh his boast that God is his Father. Let us see if his words be true. Let us prove what shall happen in the end of him. For if the just man be the Son of God, he will help him, and deliver him from the hand of his enemies. Let us examine him with despitefulness and torture, that we may know his meekness, and prove his patience. Let us condemn him with shameful death, for by his own saying he shall be respected. Such things they did imagine, and were deceived, for their own wickedness hath blinded them. As for the mysteries of God, they know them not, neither hoped they for the wages of righteousness, nor discerned a reward for blameless souls. For God created man to be immortal, and made him to be an image of his own eternity. Nevertheless, through envy of the devil came death into the world, and they that are of his side do find it. So, in that it said, he pronounces the end of the just to be blessed, and maketh his boast that God is his Father. Let's see. The word is makarizoi. That's the word blessed. I don't know things, right? And this is daikayun. Yeah, daikayun, which is just or righteousness. Anyway, I won't try to speak Greek, but pronounces the end of the righteous or the just to be blessed. Well, in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Seems an interesting parallel. Maybe that's why that one is highlighted in there. Now, he maketh his boast that God is his Father, in John 5, and in Luke 2, Jesus answered them, My Father worketh hitherto, and I work. Therefore the Jews sought the more to kill him, because he had not only broken the Sabbath, but also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. Luke 2, And he said unto him, How is it that ye sought me? Wist ye not that I must be about my Father's business? That's when Joseph and Mary lose him in the temple. Now, moving on. Those are, I think, fascinating things that I found, which are well known in the Wisdom of Solomon. Now moving on to the Wisdom of Sirach, which is also known as Ecclesiasticus. So, it is a book much like Wisdom of Solomon and Proverbs. The prologue claims that it was written by Yeshua ben Sirah, or Jesus, son of Sirah, referred to as Jesus Sirach or Ben Sirach. Those are just historical things. So written in around 100 to 175 BC, his grandson finds the scroll and translated it into Greek from Hebrew around 117 BC. The book contains many similar words to Jesus Christ's teachings in the Beatitudes and other places in the Gospel, in addition to Proverbs and Wisdom of Solomon. For instance, it says about wisdom, They that eat me shall yet be hungry, and they that drink me shall yet be thirsty. That's Sirach 24:21. Which sounds an awful lot like, And Jesus said unto them, I am the bread of life. He that cometh to me shall never hunger, and he that believeth on me shall never thirst. Which is John 6:35. Or even, Blessed are they who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled, which is John 5:6. It seems, at least in my opinion, that Jesus was in the Sermon on the Mount and in his teachings was doing the wisdom tradition of the Jews. We just see it as random teachings, the story of Jesus, but I think they were highlighting this aspect. So, here's another one which I think is strikingly similar. So in Sirach 29:10-11, it says, Lose thy money for thy brother and thy friend, and let it not rust under a stone to be lost. Lay up thy treasure according to the commandments of the Most High, and it shall bring thee much profit, more profit than gold. Well, this seems to be the exact same thing that Jesus says in Matthew 6:19-21, and I have color-coded the phrases, Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon the earth, lose thy money under a stone, earth, right? Where moth and rust doth corrupt, let it not rust. And where thieves break through and steal, is the same as to be lost. But lay up for yourself treasure in heaven. Lay up thy treasure according to the commandments of the Most High, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. That seems to be the same as, and it shall bring thee more profit than gold. That seems to be a striking similarity. Again, written around 180 BC, so 210 years before Jesus. Now, another one, there's a phrase in Sirach 32:12, for the Lord is judge, and with him is no respect of persons. Well, God is no respecter of persons is used in Paul's writings in Romans 2:11, Ephesians 6:9, and Colossians 3:25. Is it a coincidence they use the same phrase, or did Paul write it because he was familiar with Sirach? Probably. But if you don't agree, whatever. So in the wisdom of Sirach, also, you have, there shall no evil happen unto him that feareth the Lord, but in temptation even again he will deliver him, which seems to be the same as 1 Corinthians 10:13, there hath no temptation taken you, but such is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you're able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it. Moving on, those are the crazy striking ones that I thought of and found during my studies. Now there's the book of Baruch. So Baruch is the scribe or secretary of Jeremiah. The book of Baruch is a letter from Baruch to the Jews who were taken captive into Babylon when Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiachin captive and made Zedekiah king of Judah. It says it is written 5 years into Zedekiah's reign, which would be around 600 BC, probably 592, because 597 was when Nebuchadnezzar destroys Jerusalem. So, interestingly, it answers why the vessels of the temple are taken by Nebuchadnezzar in 2 Kings chapter 24, and then again in 2 Kings chapter 25. If you read the Bible, 2 Kings 24, it says, Nebuchadnezzar comes, he destroys doesn't entirely destroy the temple, but he ransacks the temple, takes all the brass and the gold and the silver and trinkets and all the vessels, it says. So, it says he does that, and then he leaves only the poor in the land, and then he makes Zedekiah king over them. The reason why he would only leave the poor is because he wants to make them subservient to him, so they do what he says. Well, in the next chapter it says that he goes and he destroys Jerusalem. This is in the 10th year, so after the book of Baruch, but it says that he takes all the trinkets and the brass and the gold and the silver and the vessels of the Lord, and if you read it in quick succession, you're like, is this a contradiction? I thought he just took it. Well, Baruch has the answer as to why, and we're going to read it right now. So, Baruch 1 through 9, and these are the words of the book which Baruch the son of Nerius, the son of Maaseias, and the son of Zedekiah, the son of Asadias, the son of Chalcias, wrote in Babylon in the 5th year, in the 7th day of the month, which was, what time as the Chaldeans took Jerusalem and burnt it with fire. So 5 years, 7 months. And Baruch did read the words of this book in the hearing of Jeconias, the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and the ears of all the people that came to hear the book, and in the hearing of the nobles and the king's sons, and in the hearing of the elders, and of all the people, from the lowest unto the highest, even of all them that dwelt in Babylon by the river Sud. Whereupon they wept, fasted, and prayed before the Lord. They made also a collection of money, according to every man's power. They sent it to the Jerusalem under Jehoiakim the high priest, the son of Chalcias, the son of Salom, and to the priests and to all the people which were found with him at Jerusalem. So they basically, I guess you could say, pay their tithing money to the priests who are still in Jerusalem when the first temple is still alive, right? He reads what he's going to send them, which is this book. They get a collection. And then moving on, at the same time, when he received the vessels of the house of the Lord that were carried out of the temple, to return them into the land of Judah, the 10th day of the month Sivan, namely silver vessels, which Zedekiah the king of Josias, king of Judah, had made. Which means is they collected money, and then they took back the vessels that came with them from Jerusalem to Babylon. So they send them back. This is why they're in 2 Kings 24 and 25, because they got some of them back. And then it says, after that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away Jeconias, and the priests and the captives and the mighty men, and the people of the land from Jerusalem, and brought them unto Babylon. Right? There's just an intro to the book, but it answers that question. So Baruch and the letter of Jeremiah, they're pretty short. Baruch tells them to repent and to turn back to God, and he prays for their deliverance. Chapters 2 through 3 seem to record their answer of repentance and acknowledging their sins. He emphasizes that wisdom is found in following God's commandments. The book ends with Baruch promising that God will restore Jerusalem and will bring the exiles back to their homeland. The next book is the letter of Jeremiah. It warns the Israelites to avoid the idol worship of the Babylonians. He mocks idols and those who worship them, as they cannot move themselves, yet people worship them, the people who have made them. So the letter ends with Jeremiah exhorting them to remain faithful to the one true God and resist the pagan practices of those around them while in exile, which lasts for 70 years, which is recorded in the book of Jeremiah in the Bible, the prophecy of that. And Jeremiah was, I believe was he taken? I can't remember if he was taken to Babylon or if he was taken to Egypt. Not sure. Next, we have the book of Susanna, right? It is sometimes contained in the Bible as the 13th chapter of Daniel. So Susanna is a short story of Susanna, a righteous woman who does daily prayer in a secluded garden with her maids, and the story is set in Babylon, as that's where Daniel he was taken captive in the first destruction of Jerusalem, of which there was 3. Two priests are tempted to try and seduce her, and when she refuses, they say that they witnessed her commit adultery in the garden. They try to condemn her to death for adultery, so they try to seduce her. She is pious, she's a good, righteous lady, and she says no. So they make a big ruckus, they yell, they open the gate, they call everybody there, and they say that she should be put to death for adultery. So the priests give their witness, and Susanna gives her testimony or witness. So in the story, Daniel the prophet considers the matter and their testimony. He separates the priests and asks which tree was the act committed under. Both priests answer differently, and it is revealed that they made up the story. His wisdom saves Susanna from false testimony, and the priests are put to death for it. And that's the end of the story. Now, the next one is a story called Bel and the Dragon. It is another addition to the book of Daniel. Bel and the Dragon are 2 stories about idol worship of the Babylonians. So Bel, also known as Baal, Baal, is a story of how the king of Babylon believes that the statue of Baal devours the food offerings given to him overnight, every night. So the king is like, this idol is real. It eats the food at night. Daniel tells him that he can prove that it is not Baal who eats the food. At night, right before they close the door to the temple of Baal, Daniel spreads ashes all over the place, without the priests of Baal knowing. In the morning, when they open the doors, it's revealed that the priests and their families had a secret entrance into the temple, allowing them to eat all of the food. So they have footprints all over the place. So he disproves the god Baal, right? And then the second story in this is the dragon, which is an idol of a dragon. So it's a story of another statue of the Babylonians' worship. Daniel says he can slay the dragon without a sword. The king allows him to try. He mixes up fat, pitch, and hair and feeds it to the dragon statue. The statue bursts apart. The people demand that Daniel be put to death, and the king is forced to throw Daniel into the lion's den. This is why he was thrown in the lion's den in this version. So after 7 days, they find Daniel alive in the lion's den. The king of Babylon acknowledges the God of Daniel as having more power and being real. The next story is called the Prayer of Azariah. The Prayer of Azariah is purportedly the prayer that Abednego said while Shadrach, Meshach, and him, Abednego, were thrown in the fiery furnace. Azariah prays to God while he and his companions are in the fiery furnace. The prayer begins with a confession of the people's sins and a recognition that their suffering is just punishment for their disobedience. Azariah acknowledges God's righteousness and faithfulness. Azariah fervently appeals to God's mercy and asks for deliverance, not because of the righteousness, but because of God's goodness and covenant promises. So then there's the Song of the 3 Children. This one is an angel descends into the furnace to cool and keep them safe. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego then sing a song of praise, calling all creation to praise God, the heavens, the earth, the waters, and all living creatures. So just a recorded version of that. Now, moving on, there's only 2 more books left. We have what is called First Maccabees. So the writer of First Maccabees writes a history of what is called the Maccabean Revolt. which starts around 180 BC. Antiochus Epiphanes, the king of what is called the Seleucid Empire of the Persians or Assyrians, I can't remember. He decrees that all people will be of the same religion, which is that of Greece. They are all required to eat the sacrifice that was given on the altar of Zeus or Jupiter. That's what he decrees. This is technically after he defeats Egypt and takes over the land of Jerusalem. Then he decrees everybody should be the same religion, right? So some of the Jews forsake their religion by submitting to the decree, while others defy his order. So this is the story of that happening. So the writer of the history connects his history to the events prophesied in Isaiah, Amos, and Daniel, right? Specifically, he quotes Isaiah's, "They have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinances, and broken the everlasting covenant," which is Isaiah 24:5. He also quotes Amos's, "And from the north to the east shall men run hither and thither, seeking the word of the Lord, and they shall not find it," which is Amos 8:11. And then also he quotes Daniel, "And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate," which is Daniel 11:31. So he claims that those are talking about his day. So he records that Antiochus decrees to set up the statue of Zeus in the, I guess it would be the Temple of Herod, the temple in Jerusalem. So they want to put the statue of Zeus in the temple, and those who refuse the sacrifice will be put to death. And then it records how the I don't know what word I wrote there. Oh, they scour Jerusalem for the writings of the law, and they rip them into shreds and burn them, and put those to death who perform circumcision, right? So if they follow the old religion, or if they have the books of the law, right? Interestingly about this is, that's one reason why we don't have so many ancient copies of the Hebrew Old Testament. Because in this story, if it's right, and I believe Josephus claims it's right as well, Antiochus tells all of his, they wouldn't be centurions, all his people, his captains, whatever, to search them out and destroy them. Interestingly enough, one reason the Old Testament is preserved is because at that time in Alexandria, Egypt, the Septuagint was translated in the Library of Alexandria, which means even if he was 100% successful in getting rid of all the writings of the law, we would have still had it, because it was in the Library of Alexandria. So, in the story, Mattathias, who is a priest, he kills a Jew who goes in front of everyone to partake of the sacrifice to Zeus, and then he convinces the Jews who are faithful to follow him to the mountains. When it presents that story, it says it's the same as what Phineas does in the Old Testament, who was the son of Aaron, who does a very similar thing. When Phineas does it, someone's committing fornication or something with one of the wives, his wife from a different race or something, I don't remember, but he ends up killing both of them. So it makes a connection. He defends the covenant, kills them, and then he says everybody should follow him into the mountains. So his son, Judas Maccabeus, ends up leading the Jews from that time forward, and they war for religious freedom from Antiochus's reign. Eventually, after winning many battles and seeing how dire the situation is, Judas Maccabeus sends an envoy to Rome to seek their help. So he tries to go to Rome to bypass the Seleucid Empire, right? Because Antiochus is the king of the Seleucid Empire. So he goes to Rome to seek their help. This is when Jerusalem becomes subject to Rome, which continues into the New Testament. Judas eventually dies, and his brother Jonathan takes over and does similar to him. He then dies, and his brother Simon leads them. That's just kind of the ending of the story. They succeed. Well, on the note of the statue of, right, Antiochus decreed to put up a statue of Zeus in the temple, which is when all of this happens, because he desecrated the temple. He set up the abomination of desolation, which is what Daniel 11 talks about. So at the end of the story, they succeed in cleansing the temple, and they restore it to the worship of their God, who is Jehovah or Yahweh. Well, this story is the reason why the Jews celebrate Hanukkah, or the Feast of the Dedication, the Feast of the rededication of the temple after they cleansed it of the abomination of desolation. Interesting history. Then the next book, which is the last one, is Second Maccabees, written by another person, right? So in the introduction to Second Maccabees, the writer explains that they are making a smaller record in their book of a 5-book series written by someone named Jason of Cyrene. They will narrate the history and add their words as needed for brevity. The first couple chapters are in the form of a letter to the Alexandrian Jews to celebrate Hanukkah and follow the customs continually. And then it tells a story, right? Prominent among the stories in the Second Maccabee are miracles not included in the stories shared in First Maccabees. It is not a continuation of or related to First Maccabees. It is just written by another writer. It includes miraculous angels helping Judas Maccabees and other apparitions whenever they seemingly occurred during the story or the tale. It includes the story of the martyrdom of Eleazar, who was a scribe. So, in the story, Antiochus tries to force the Jews to eat pork, the sacrifice to Zeus. And Eleazar refuses. He is an old man at the time who says his example will strengthen others. People try to convince him to fake eating the sacrifice, and he refuses and says basically he has integrity and will not do it or fake doing it. He is tortured to death and never wavers. So, the next story is of a mother and her 7 sons who each in turn are tortured to death in front of her before she is also killed. All of them refuse to eat the pork. It specifically says this, that they did this with a hope of being resurrected with perfect bodies in the future. This one is super interesting because Paul refers to this story in Hebrews 11:35-37 when this is the one I talked about earlier, the by faith chapter of Hebrews 11. By faith Abraham did this, by faith Noah did that, by faith blah 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 did this, by faith Joseph did that. And then at the end of it, he's like, I'm not going to expound every single version of this. And then he says, by faith, blah, 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 this other thing happened. And then he says, by faith, women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trials of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, they were tempted, they were slain by the sword. They wandered around in sheepskin and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented. That is what he says about the story recorded in Second Maccabees. If he's claiming that it's a correct story, maybe it's an important book, especially since it was written as a smaller record of 5 books written by Jason of Cyrene, which are lost. But we have the story because Second Maccabees was written. Interesting. Now, Second Maccabees ends with the successful cleansing of the temple and the celebration of Hanukkah, just like First Maccabees does. And those are the books of the Apocrypha and what they talk about. Some of the history on why, how they were either accepted or not accepted by the Jews, the Christians, that type of thing. I thoroughly enjoyed reading them. I think I learned a ton. I hope I have explained coherently what some of this history of the Apocrypha is, what the books talk about, and maybe it piques your interest on maybe you want to read them as well. Thank you. And if you like this video, please sure to like and subscribe. Ask any questions in the comments, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.